Hello, I'm Rida Fakhri. I'm delighted to moderate this special Facebook Live discussion ahead of International Women's Day. This year's theme is Time is Now. Rural and urban women transforming women's lives. It dovetails, of course, with the recent ongoing debates that have been happening across the world about sexual harassment and sexual abuse and exploitation of women. But we are making our own headlines here today with the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, who is a long-time and strong advocate of women's rights and gender parity. He is here to take your questions and to tell us what the UN is doing and what, in some cases, it isn't doing enough of to enhance women's rights. It is a critical and long overdue discussion. I'm sure activist Monica Ramirez, President of the Alianza Nacional de Campesinas, which is a nationwide US-based farm workers' women's organization. She will tell us, I hope, and agree that time is now to act. She has been working tirelessly to propel the movement of rural women to the national stage. Her movement has even inspired the Time's Up Hollywood movement of women's rights called, as I say, Time's Up. So well done for projecting this topic onto the national stage. And of course, the youth is essential to this discussion. Today, young people are 50% of the world's population. So it is a pleasure as well to speak to the recently appointed Secretary General Special Envoy on Youth, Jayatma Vikramanayake, who will tell us about young women and girls can do, but indeed perhaps as well what young boys and men should be doing and how engaged and galvanized they are in this discussion, certainly with the fact that there have been so many marches around the world, hashtags, online campaigns that have really given a lot of impetus to this movement. So let's see how much further we can take it. So today, on the eve of International Women's Day, let me just say briefly, we are here to celebrate the unwavering commitment and hard work of activists, civil society, international organizations, everyone around the world who has been central to this goal to push gender equality. We're also here to engage with all of you joining this global online discussion. And since it is online, I would say don't hold your punches. Send us your questions. And let me, on this note, first turn to you, Secretary General Antonio Guterres. As I point out, since before you became Secretary General, which is over a year ago, as Prime Minister of Portugal, I know that you did quite a bit to push through your own government measures to make sure that governments take the issues relating to sexual violence against women more seriously. As Secretary General, you've also pushed this whole notion of gender parity and a zero-tolerance policy at the United Nations. Why do you think are we seeing such extraordinary momentum today when these crimes have long existed? Why now, and how do we build on it?
Well, I think that there is an extraordinary dynamic movement, and this dynamic movement is going to the center of the problem. And the problem is power. Power relations in the world, in a world that is a male-dominated world with a male-dominated culture. And that is why sexual harassment happens in such a dramatic way. That's why sexual exploitation and abuse happens in such a dramatic way. And that is why to change the balance of power is the most important measure. When we adopted parity as an objective, it is because parity goes to the center of the power question. Yeah. And I think it is absolutely crucial to understand that it's not only related to the rights of women or gender equality or... No, it's better for the world. If there is parity, if there is a balance of power between women and men, we will have less conflict, better prevention and better solution of conflicts, have more fair globalization, probably will be more effective fighting climate change. And so this is a central question of power, and I believe that there is a conscience of this need, and that is why this movement is gaining such a strong impetus, and we will do everything possible to support it.
And I think you went straight to the heart of the issue. Power. How do you actually take on these centers of power? We are here at the United Nations. I mean, nowhere in the world symbolizes power more than here. How do you, as Secretary General, take on the 193 member states to actually move this conversation forward, to actually implement the kind of legislation that would respect and uphold women's rights? How do you do it?
Well, first of all, power is never given. Power is always taken, which means we need to mobilize our capacities, our strengths, in order to be able to make people understand the need to change. Now, the good news is that the movement in the civil society is so strong The movement in the public opinion is so strong, the movement in the media is so strong, that it's easier to force politicians to make changes that in other circumstances probably they wouldn't.
But is it time to speak then truth to power, to push them a little bit
Truth
harder?
is the instrument that we need to use at all times for all purposes. When we try to cheat, we will lose.
You mentioned civil society and, of course, human rights activists as well. The Secretary General have certainly been leading the charge, far away from the red tape, the bureaucracy of international organizations, or the constraints of many governments. Monica Ramirez, you were born here in the United States. I know you are the granddaughter of immigrants, farm workers from Mexico. You used your legal background to highlight the injustices that many of these farm worker women have long suffered away from the spotlight. How did a movement like yours end up giving a voice to these women and partnering with the most unlikely of partners, really, celebrities in Hollywood?
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. You know, it's the women themselves, the farm worker women themselves on the ground around the country who have risen up and have clearly stated what they need to survive and thrive, and have really inspired all of us, myself included as an activist, to gather all of our resources and strengths to help bring their voices forward. You know, I think that oftentimes when people think about farm worker women and others who live in the shadows because they have less access and less power, people don't recognize how much organizing is already happening on the ground, from their families to their communities and outside. And so farm worker women, in this case, have been leading on the issue of sexual harassment against them in the United States for over 30 years. And so the moment came where we had the opportunity to extend our hand to the women in Hollywood who are coming forward to talk about the violence against them, and to really lend them our support and expertise as they begin to fight this fight in their own industry. And so it's really the strength of the women on the ground who brought this forward.
And ironically, the sexual harassment cases that have really exploded in Hollywood and shaken the whole industry up, including other key industries here in the United States as well, and probably around the world, that has helped propel your movement. But I wonder if you don't feel that still the discussion, when we talk about violence against women, seems to be grabbing the headlines and more centered around women in big cities, in the rich developed world. How much more do we need to focus on the women in the shadows, in rural areas, in the more remote parts of the world?
We definitely need to focus more on the women in the remote parts of the world, because the issue of sexual violence in the workplace has been one that's existed for decades, for years and years. And it's not just in one industry. It's not just against agricultural workers. It's against restaurant workers, domestic workers, healthcare workers. And so there is not a single industry in this world where we can say that this is not a major problem. And so we need to look at the experiences of the most marginalized among us, come up with solutions to help reach and serve them, and then those solutions can then be applied to other industries that maybe have more access and power. And that's what we're seeing in Hollywood.
And just very briefly, do you think the media is doing a good enough job? Is it doing the job of covering this with the kind of integrity that you'd expect?
I think that the media has more work to do in telling the stories of the women who live in the shadows. Certainly through the Time's Up movement, the women in Hollywood have lent their platform and have been encouraging the media to tell the stories of women who work in other industries. But now we need the media to respond by covering those stories and in a respectful manner, because many of the women who are coming forward to talk about what has happened to them, they have experienced great trauma. And so in telling these stories, it is very critical that the media use great care to ensure that they are not traumatizing the women again as they come forward and bravely share their experiences.
And as you say, it's something that is going on around the world, of course, that has become amplified because of social media.
But if I may interrupt on this, I think what's happening now is very important, because there was a certain idea that this kind of problem, sexual harassment, sexual exploitation, abuse, were in remote locations, in backward cultures. No, this is in the center of our modern societies. Yeah. Family violence was one of the most difficult issues I had to tackle when I was Prime Minister in Portugal. People would just reject the idea that there was family violence. Right. Yeah. And there was, and there is family violence. So what is important now is that this was brought to the set. This is a problem that exists everywhere, and it's a problem that needs to be dealt everywhere.
Exactly, and quite often the cultural norms dictate that it is dealt with such impunity, with law enforcement really turning a blind eye while knowing that this is going on. Jayathma, let me turn to you, Special Envoy on Youth of the Secretary General's. It may surprise many to hear that so much of this is going on in the US, but as we say, it's going on around the world. I know you have been on recent travels in Africa. You've been speaking to a lot of young people. I wonder to what extent you think the youth, girls I say, but boys as well, are involved in this, and to what extent do we need to tackle the root of the problem by educating them earlier and sensitizing them to this issue?
Well, I think I just need to also touch upon when you asked SG, why is the time now? You know, why do we say time's up? I think from the perspective of a young person also, as you very correctly said, we are the largest generation that the world is seeing in the history. We have about 1.8 billion young people under the age of 24, but if you consider the age of 30, then it's about half of the world's population. So we've seen change in the past. We've seen incremental change, how step by step we achieve somewhere. But if we go at this pace, in order to achieve full parity, it's going to take us 100 years. So this generation, our generation, is really the key to make that transformational change that we are looking for, because incremental change can't wait. We have to bring in that transformational change to achieve the Sustainable Development Agenda by 2030, achieve Goal 5 and all the other goals. And this is the generation that we need to mobilize to get there. So for us, we are here, we are now, and the time is now for young people as well.
As you say, you have to change a lot of mindsets, but there's a lot of potential there. 1.8 million people, as you say, between the ages of 10 and 24 around the world. Are their voices being heard, though? Are we investing enough in them? When I say we, the United Nations and others.
I mean, quite honestly, I don't think we are doing enough. We are certainly not putting our money where our mouths are. I was just traveling in West Africa. I've been in 5 countries where I met young women and girls on the ground. I had meetings with them in markets, in classrooms, near the wells and different places. And the key questions that they are going through are definitely the access to education and access to healthcare. But we are not doing enough to make those investments so that they can thrive, they can break the vicious cycles of poverty and really come out of where they are now to be able to contribute to the society in their fullest potential. So issues like child marriage, female genital mutilation, really not only health-wise impacts their future, but also it affects their dignity, their human rights, and does not enable them to participate fully in their societies.
And this, of course, involves and affects all of us. I mean, we've got so much interest online, so many questions and comments that have come through in the last few days and certainly are coming through now. So let me go straight to one of them, Secretary General, and put this question to you. It comes from Amrita, who is in India. She says, or she asks, how can we eradicate double standards at the workplace regarding women? In India, for instance, a double standard exists for what women wear, how they behave, whereas men can usually do anything they want. What advice would you give her? And I know double standards has long been an accusation directed at the UN, but perhaps not in what women wear and what they do, as far as I know. But still, what advice would you give her?
It's a question of power. I mean, it's a question of women having influence and power within. If this is in the private sector, the companies where they operate, or the administration, or whatever. I mean,
how do you implement that zero policy tolerance for sexual harassment at the workplace?
No. First, if you live in a society in which parity becomes a reality, it is much more difficult to have sexual harassment. Imagine an office in which you have a boss that is a man, 10 men and 2 women. It is obvious that these 2 women will be in a much more dangerous situation. Imagine that the boss is a woman, that there are 5 women and 5 men. Sexual harassment will be much more difficult. So again, it is centrally a question of power, but not only power. Then we need to make sure that you have, first, a proper mechanism for people to be able to trust the system, to be able to raise, I mean, when they are victims, to have someone that they trust, that they can convey what has happened, and the system of investigation that is fair and it is quick. And that is what we are trying to change in the UN. We have now an helpline in the Secretariat that we have to allow for people without necessarily identifying themselves to explain what has happened and to try to get information about what are the ways in which they can see their problem being addressed. And then we are creating a special area of investigation in our investigation system, essentially with women and specialized on sexual harassment, in order to make sure that whenever there is a violation, that violation is effectively detected and that the punishment is effectively found.
But how do you implement the punishment, though, briefly, Secretary General? Because it's all wonderful. I mean, it's music to everyone's ears to hear that all this has to happen, but how do you actually compel governments, even local authorities, to end impunity? Do you maybe publish a name-shame list? I know the list would be
There
long.
are things we can do, first of all, inside the organization. No, I mean, and that has to do with disciplinary procedures and things of the sort to make sure that those that misbehave within the organization are effectively punished.
Yeah.
And then there is all the work of advocacy that we have to do with governments and the role of the Human Rights High Commissioner, the role of the different human rights bodies of the UN, the capacity to denounce violations where they take place, and obviously the capacity to interact with the media, with the social society, with the activists, because it is by our common action in the same direction that will force governments, administrations, local powers to understand that they need to act.
I'll go to another question, Secretary General, but we just got a comment, as mentioned by the ESG. Someone writes, I haven't got the name here, power isn't given, it's taken. To take the power, women need to be capacitated, or at least need to be empowered, which goes to the heart of what you've been saying. They need to have the incentive to go out and work feeling protected. Let me get to a question from Nigeria now, with Aderonke asking, she says, often any woman standing for gender equality is seen as a threat to her husband and so societal norms. How can we simplify the message of gender equality? An important question, I think, about the messaging in today's hashtag world. And I think, Monica, you are best placed to take this one on, having really come up, I think, along with some help, with the Time's Up slogan.
I think the message is easy. When women succeed, the world succeeds. And we need to ensure that people understand that as women come forward and assert their rights and assert their power, that we're not doing it only for ourselves, we're doing it for our families, we're doing it for our communities, and we're doing it for our countries and for our world. If women have what they need in order to survive and thrive, then we all do better.
But how do we simplify the message and make sure that more people are on board, that they get it?
This is Nigeria. The number 2 of the UN is a Nigerian woman. And if a Nigerian woman can be the number 2 of the UN, any Nigerian woman can be very important in the Nigerian system. It is to the benefit of Nigeria that Nigerian women assume a much stronger role in the Nigerian politics, in the Nigerian society, companies, etc.
As important as that is, and I think you're right to point it out, Secretary General, is it also symbolic, really, more than anything else, to have women in some top positions?
It's not a question of symbolism. It's a question of doing the right thing. They are there because they are the best to do it.
Right. That's right.
It's not a concession that we make for... No, it's if you are fair, if you are not biased, you will have women in very important positions.
Let's go to a question from Eslin in Turkey. She asks, how can we get involved in the women's rights movement started in the global north with hashtags like Me Too and Time's Up in other parts of the world? What is the best way to get our voices heard in the decision-making processes in our countries? Jayathma.
Well, I mean, starting from the Arab Spring to the Women's March to the Occupy Wall Street campaign, we've seen how young people came out from schools, from universities, really demanding for that space, demanding for change, demanding for transparency. And even though the movements like Time's Up and different others have getting the spotlight in most of the media, we also know many rural activists, many young women and men living in the most rural areas of the world who are fighting their own struggles within their communities, sometimes challenging their religious leaders, sometimes working together with their community leaders, indigenous leaders, to make sure that there is intergenerational dialogue between different parts of our society. So it doesn't matter where you are or where you come from, these issues, as SG said, are universal. So there's something that you can always do about it. It could be about you, it could be about someone around you, it might be also about someone you don't even know. But I think the real key is that you stand up for what's right, you speak up about it, and you actually translate those hashtags into actions.
No matter what the challenges might be, in many cases cultural challenges. A question here that goes to the heart of that issue. Elsa Cervera says, hi, I'm from Mexico, living in New York City. How can we re-educate and change the macho man culture, speaking for my Latin country, to gain more respect for women? We have the bro culture in Silicon Valley, the macho culture elsewhere. How important first for you, Monica, is it to educate the men around you? And how easy is it for you to take on this generational issue when, your parents and grandparents' generation, I suppose, were much more, not macho, but much more traditional in their way of thinking?
Yeah, it's extremely important for us to be talking about this issue and both the problems and the solutions with men and women. We need to engage men in the conversation because men should be our allies in changing the power dynamics and ensuring that women are respected and safe in the workplace in every place. And so I think that by having the conversation around issues that have been historically taboo, that's how we're going to begin to see the culture shift that's required. And I think that, for us in our work, as we've gone from different rural communities around the country, educating about sexual harassment against farm worker women, one of the things that has moved some of the men who have been in those audiences and at those events is when we start talking about what is the impact of this kind of harm on their daughters, on their wives, and on other women that they love and respect. And that really brings them into the conversation in a way that they perhaps had not been brought in before.
Bringing men into the conversation, turning them into our allies.
Add something to that. In my work, that when I work with young boys and young men and boys, there are two things that I see. First is there's this strong sense of entitlement. I think it also kind of couples with the idea of symbolism. When a woman takes up a leadership position, it is said, oh, she took up a man's job. Whereas there's a strong sense of entitlement that these are men's positions taken by women, whereas we don't see that there are equal opportunities for men and women to take those positions.
Mr. General, you're in the unusual position of being in the minority here, but I do have to get your perspective on where men stand.
I want to raise your attention for a new danger. We have seen enormous progress in educational systems. In my country, there are more women graduating in university than men. We are seeing enormous progress in public administrations, even progressive in the private sector. But in high tech, we are seeing a new trend of male dominance. We are seeing not enough women gaining position in high tech. Silicon Valley is probably more male dominated than Mexico. And this is something in which we need to make a huge effort with also young women, attracting them as much as possible for these kind of professions, with the companies themselves, making them understand that gender parity is very important also in the way they operate. We cannot allow to have a bubble of traditional male dominance in the more sophisticated areas of technology.
Yeah, breaking down these stereotypes and getting women interested in the sciences as well. I have a question for you, Secretary General, from Jack McNulty in Australia. In having achieved gender parity at the top levels of the UN, he says, what is your advice for leaders around the world who want to follow your lead in establishing a 50-50 leadership?
It's very simple. Make 50% of nominations of women and 50% of men. It's very simple.
How important is it to have a woman at the top?
It's very important to have a woman at the top. But I mean, what is important is to understand that organizations work better with parity than with the predominance of any of the gender groups. I mean, I also would not be in favor of having in the UN only women in the lead and no men. I think it's the balance that makes our world better.
Do you see a woman taking over at the end of your term, which I have to say has just begun? Your 2 terms, I should say.
When I was campaigning, I said, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do. I'm not a woman. I'm a man. So that I cannot change. But I think that it's perfectly normal to have a woman at the head of the UN, to have a woman at the head of any of the countries of the world, big or small, to have a woman at the head of the most important companies in the world. I mean, there shouldn't be no distinction at all. And I recognize we are far from it.
But hopefully not that far.
But we are moving in the right direction. And this movement is very important.
And so let me, in the 5 minutes remaining, get your thoughts with a question that I've received and just the way you see the way forward to each one of you. Jayathma, starting with you. A question from Maria. She says, hi, I'm 10 years old and from New York and just came back from the Montessori Model UN, where I got to report from the podium of the General Assembly. Very excited. She says it was very inspiring. What can someone my age do to help make girls' lives better around the world?
Okay,
and your final thoughts.
First of all, you're 10 years. When I was 10 years, I didn't even know the UN existed. So you're really cool. And you are on Twitter, which is even cooler. Well, there's a lot that we can do as individuals. The first thing is what it says in the New York City subway. When you see something, say something. This could be one of your friends getting bullied at school, some of your girls in the community being discriminated because they are women, or maybe yourself being told that you can't do certain things because you're a girl. So always stand up and make the case that you can, and being a girl doesn't really affect what you are. Maya Angelou once said, when a woman stands up for herself, she, without knowing, she stands up for all women. So that's one. Two is join a youth organization, a girls organization who does tremendous work like the Girl Scout, the Girl Guides, the YWCA, who has large networks across the world who help other young women to develop leadership skills and makes a platform to bring all voices together. Third, you could organize a bake sale or a fundraiser in your school, in your Montessori, and donate that money to an organization that works on empowering girls and young women in Africa or Asia. And fourth, you live in the United States, so the developing countries has foreign aid programs. You can write a letter to your president, your Congress, your Minister for Foreign Affairs, asking and urging that they give more foreign aid to programs that focus on girls and young women. And fifthly and finally, always fight for full parity, full equality and justice. Don't settle for anything less.
Lots of very inspiring, creative ways to help. And Maria, I hope you've been taking note, even at the young age of 10. So just moving along to you, Monica, in your final comments, a question. Manjuma from Bangladesh asks, how do we change parents with strict religious ideologies, attitudes and behaviors to eliminate reduced gender discrimination? So really the generational factor, Monica. How easy was it for you? What would your advice be?
My advice would be to, keep having conversations with our parents, with our aunts and uncles, with our elders, with other people about all the contributions that women are making, all the important strides that our countries and world are making because of the contributions of women. I think that, one of the difficulties is that change is difficult because people fear change. And if we can show the positive contributions and impact that women are making, that will help perhaps bring people along so that they can understand that there is a way forward with women in leadership. Maybe it wasn't done that way in the past, but with taking on this new frame of mind, sort of showing the ways that women are successful and are making a huge impact, that might perhaps bring people to a new place of understanding that there is really no role that women cannot hold and that women should not hold.
Monica, thanks very much. Secretary General, your final thoughts and your closing comments on this important day, on the eve of International Women's Day. You've said a few months ago, you said here at the UN that it is time to collectively work together to end violence against women for good. Of course, music to all of our ears. But again, the question is, how do you help civil society activists who really put their lives on the line to push this movement forward? How do you give this movement enough of your attention when you've got so many vital competing issues on your agenda?
But this is a vital issue. And to support these movements is to do what is vital for the world to be better. These questions of gender equality or ending sexual harassment or whatever, it's not just a matter of a concession made. No. I'm a true believer of the need to mobilize women and men together, making everybody understand that gender equality is good for women and good for men because it makes the world better for all.
On this note, thank you very much indeed, Secretary General Antonio Guterres, Monica Ramirez, and Jayatma Vikramaniaki. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us in this Facebook discussion, and thank you very much for your participation, comments, and questions. Thank you.